Hey, what's up everybody, it's Craw and welcome back to another Terraria tier list. This time we're wrapping up the main class weapons with the magic weapon tier list. Let's go ahead and get straight into it. But first, if you like this video and you like me, make sure to like and subscribe, and you can go and join the Discord down below to hang out with me outside of videos. And if you want to support me, you can go ahead and become a member with the join button. Obviously, you don't have to do that, so don't worry about it. Alright, let's get started with the pre-hard mode wands. First up, we have the Wand of Sparking. Now, the Wand of Sparking overall is a decent enough weapon to just grab out of a chest right at the start of the game, but the ability to immediately upgrade it and its overall mediocre damage lands it in a nice little spot in the F tier, sorry. The Wand of Frosting, however, is undoubtedly a better option than the Sparking just for how easy it is to get, as well as Frostburn being a slightly better debuff. We'll put it in C tier just for being an actual upgrade to the Wand of Sparking. They're pretty similar though. Next, we have the Amethyst, Topaz, and Sapphire staves. These three staves are almost completely pointless when it comes to making them, as most of the staff options are, unless you're grabbing the highest tier. So we're going to put these in the F tier. Next, we have the Emerald, Amber, Ruby, and Diamond staves. Now, these narrowly avoid the F tier due to their high fire rate, as well as piercing up to 2 enemies instead of only hitting 1. Overall, these are very usable for being obtainable before doing anything else, but not better than some of the later staves at all. Next, we have the Thunder Zapper. Now, the Thunder Zapper, very similarly to the last 4 staves, narrowly avoids the F tier. This one, however, doesn't have the piercing of the staves, but it has similar damage to the highest tiers and a much faster fire rate ending in similar DPS. We're going to put it in the C tier. Next up is the Vile Thorn. Now, the Vile Thorn is great. You can get it as soon as you get bombs dropping from Shadow Orbs in the Corruption, and it pierces like infinite enemies and is a great option for the Eater of Worlds and the Goblin Army. The Vile Thorn is going to end up in the B tier for its great early uses. Next, we have the Weather Pane. Very similar in use to the Vile Thorn, this item is dropped by Deerclops. It pierces enemies for a short period of time and almost acts like a summon, homing in on enemies and following them until it disappears. I'm going to put the Weather Pane in A tier, it's very solid. Next, we have the Aqua Scepter. The Aqua Scepter is one of my favorite dungeon weapons in the game. I'm going to throw it in the S tier for its great use against the Wall of Flesh, giving you a nice smooth entry into hard mode and being usable in those early stages as well. Next, we have the Magic Missile. I'm unfortunately going to have to destroy the Magic Missile here. It's vastly inferior to the Aqua Scepter in every way, doesn't do anything against the Wall of Flesh, and can be easily replaced with an item from the Shadow Chests at exactly the same time. Decent at single target damage in hard mode, but can still be replaced with the next item, F tier for the Magic Missile. Next, we have the Flame Lash. Now, I really like the Flame Lash, especially over the Magic Missile. It does just a little less damage, but it can hit the enemy multiple times, or it can hit a few enemies before exploding. It also sets enemies on fire, which is great, and a far superior weapon to the Magic Missile, even into hard mode. B tier for the Flame Lash. Next, we have the Flower of Fire. Now, this is my least favorite weapon from the entire Shadow Chest group, but it can still do quite a bit of damage and fires decently fast, and for that alone, I have to put it in the C tier. Decent weapon, but it's overall not super fun to use. Finally, moving into the hard mode wands, we have the Sky Fracture. One of the earliest wands you can get in hard mode, the Sky Fracture is super capable. It's definitely not the best of the early options, but I do like it a lot thanks to its burst damage being fairly high, and it's an okay option for the twins, so we're going to put it into the B tier. Next, we have the Meteor Staff. Now, this is a fantastic weapon. It's incredibly easy to make, and it can carry you through almost all of the mech bosses and even further. It has a high mana cost, but an insane damage output, definitely an S tier weapon. This is the mage version of the Daedalus Stormbow. Next, we have the Crystal Serpent. The Crystal Serpent is a very solid option for beginner hard mode mages. It can easily take care of the twins, and you can even use it as a decent option for an early Fishron fight. If it was equally as good for all 3 mech bosses, I'd put it up in the S tier, but it's pretty bad for the Destroyer, so I'm going to put it in the A tier. While I really like the Crystal Vile Shard for its aesthetic and being an upgrade to the Vile Thorn, and it being easily obtainable from Hallowed Mimics, but it just has so little use outside of some early hard mode events, and it can shred through the Destroyer, but overall, there are better weapons. If it had more widespread use, it would be better, but I'm going to have to stick it into the C tier for now. Next up, the Life Drain. The Life Drain is almost similar to the Crystal Vile Shard in a way. It has a small AoE range that does a similar amount of damage, except it gives you a life regen buff, so we're going to throw it into the B tier for that alone. The Poison Staff. Now, while really solid with a decent fire rate and high damage shotgun blasts, it is not the greatest to use. It has a pretty short range and doesn't really become fantastic until it's upgraded with Chlorophyte after the mechs. I'm going to put it into C tier just because it's a weapon pretty much made for upgrading. The Frost Staff. Now, the Frost Staff is basically a superior version of the Sky Fracture. It fires consistently instead of in burst, fires much faster, and inflicts a very powerful Frostburn effect. It also pierces up to 3 enemies, so we're going to throw it into the A tier. Great weapon, but I hardly ever see it used, and I never use it myself. The Flower of Frost. Now, I really hate the Flower of Frost. It has a high damage number and it fires really fast, but it just has terrible range with its arcing ice ball and absolutely no piercing. I'm putting it straight into the F tier. It's just a mid weapon for this point in the game. The Unholy Trident. Now the Unholy Trident is very similar to the Frost Staff, just with a far higher damage cap, so I have to just throw it in the A tier alongside it and call it a day. It's much slower, but its damage makes up for that. Great weapon to use if you have no other options and need a quick damage up. Next up is the Rainbow Rod. Now the Rainbow Rod is basically just an upgraded magic missile and flame lash. I think at this point in the game it is not great. I'm gonna put it in the F tier. I just don't like it that much, I'm sorry, but F tier for the Rainbow Rod. The Tome of Infinite Wisdom. Yet another Sky Fracture-esque upgrade. The Tome of Infinite Wisdom is dropped by ogres in the Old One's army, and it has a fast fire rate with its left click, and it can launch a big sand tornado with a right click, which gives it great single target damage, and great damage for enemies like the Destroyer and big groups of enemies. And it can actually just completely obliterate the Destroyer as well if you're having trouble, so I'm going to put it into the A tier. Next up is the Nettle Burst. Now the Nettle Burst would be plopped straight into F tier if it had worse damage. Luckily for it, it has the perfect position of being useful in the Golem fight for dealing damage to all 3 parts in the first phase, as well as being useful in the dungeon with its insane piercing damage. However, anywhere else this thing is not great. It has terrible range for any of the post-Plantera and Golem bosses, and it's going to rest nicely in the C tier for that reason. The Venom Staff. Finally, we have the upgrade to the Poison Staff. And this thing is actually very solid. It's what I used to take out Plantera for the first time in my Wands only playthrough, and it does that job splendidly well. It's also decent for Golem, but other than that, I can't really see it having the greatest uses. It fires a decently slow projectile with a spread pattern. I'm going to put it into the B tier. It's a very good option that can help you take out a few bosses in the game. The Shadow Beam Staff. Now this is a fantastic option to take you right into the endgame of both Wands only and mages in general. It's especially a great option for Duke Fishron and other incredibly fast enemies thanks to its hit scan nature, and it's great for large groups thanks to its infinite piercing. Definitely an A tier weapon. Unfortunately, I don't think it's that good for the Moonlord, or else it would go straight into the S tier. Now, unlike the Shadow Beam Staff, the Inferno Fork has a very slow projectile, but it explodes into a fiery ball that stays around and does a ton of damage, if the enemy stays in it. It's great for situations like farming the Destroyer or taking on the Moon events, especially dealing with both the regular enemies and the mini-bosses. I'm going to put it into B tier since it can't deal with most of the late game bosses, but it absolutely melts through events. The Spectre Staff. I would normally put something like this into C tier. It's a basic staff that is generally worse than both the Inferno and Shadow Beam staffs, but this weapon does have some homing potential with really high damage. Overall, I like it, but it's definitely not as good as the other two, but just not bad enough to throw into the C tier, so it goes into B tier. The Bat Scepter. I love the Bat Scepter. One of my favorite wands in the entire game. It has crazy homing and it fires out a ton of bats that just fly towards the enemy, dealing massive DPS. It's a great option for Fishron, the Empress, and even the Moonlord. It's gotta go into the S tier, definitely one of my favorite magic weapons in the game. Following up the Bat Scepter, we have the Razor Pine, and it does almost everything the Bat Scepter does, but better. The only thing I'll give the Bat Scepter over the Razor Pine is that homing ability, letting you make more distance than this weapon. But that doesn't stop this thing from shredding almost every late game boss in seconds. S tier for sure. The Blizzard Staff. Part of me really wanted to put this into the A tier, but while using it, I just realized that it's just as good as the last two. The Blizzard Staff's insane fire rate and hail of ice from the sky is just crazy. It's essentially an in-game version of the Meteor Staff and the Daedalus Stormbow, and that's just crazy. S tier for the Blizzard Staff. The Resonant Scepter. Okay. So I really like the Resonant Scepter. My only issue with it is that it's just a very small AoE when you cast it, and the fact that its best enemies are way before you'd be able to obtain this, since you need to get the princess first. Overall, I'm going to put it into B tier just for that reason alone. It's a great weapon, but its best cases are not the in-game bosses, and that's for sure. The Staff of Earth. Okay. So for a post-Golem weapon, this thing is the definition of mediocre. It tries to lure you in with its crazy high damage number, but it's way too slow and its range is not fantastic since it's a projectile that has gravity. I'm going to stick into the C tier just because its high damage number can still make it useful in those late game stages and events. Betsy's Wrath. Now, as much as I want to put this into S tier, I have two major issues with it. One, Betsy. You need to get to Betsy and beat her in the tier 3 Old One's army to get this thing. And two, its range. The range of the Betsy's Wrath is just not good enough, unfortunately. If it had less of an arch to its attack, it would easily go into the S tier, but it's a little difficult to use against the game's hardest bosses, despite its insane DPS. A tier for Betsy's Wrath. Now, let's move over to the magic guns. First, we have the Space Gun. The Space Gun has experienced a crazy fall from grace for me. It used to be the preferred weapon of myself and many others against bosses like the Wall of Flesh due to that meteor armor set bonus, but now it can barely even stand up to some of the early bosses. It still does do a decent amount of damage, and with the meteor armor set bonus, it can still be pretty viable for at least grabbing the next gun on the list. C tier for the Space Gun. The B Gun. Now the B Gun here is being rated as if you were also using the Hive Pack, because let's be honest, if you're using the B Gun, you're using the Hive Pack. I really love the B Gun, and it's my personal favorite magic gun to use for pre-hard mode, and definitely for the Wall of Flesh. Being able to just make some distance and slowly whittle away while fairly safe is a great bonus. A tier for the B Gun. The Gray Zappinator. Now the Gray Zappinator is a fantastic weapon, available from the Traveling Merchant after any pre-hard mode boss has been defeated, and normally Traveling Merchant weapons are not near the top of my list due to, well, the Traveling Merchant, but this thing is crazy. It's a little RNG dependent, but no matter what, you can bet it's the highest damage dealing magic gun on any boss in pre-hard mode. S tier for the Gray Zappinator. Next, we have the Laser Rifle. Now the Laser Rifle is actually very solid for a Wall of Flesh shop, and it has a very fast fire rate and decent damage. It can easily be used to take out the Twins or Skeletron Prime and help you progress right out of the gate in hard mode. I'm gonna put it into the B tier. The Orange Zappinator. Just like the Gray Zappinator before, this thing is crazy. I'm pretty sure it's available right into hard mode from the Traveling Merchant, and it could easily take you all the way through the mechs and Plantera, and maybe even further. Great weapon, S tier for sure. The Wasp Gun. Much like the Zappinators, this upgraded version of the B Gun is just as crazy. It gets buffed by the Hive Pack as well, and overall you can use this through big groups or just to get through Golem overall. It's a very, very great choice. A tier for the Wasp Gun. The Leaf Blower. Another weapon dropped by Plantera and another great magic gun. The Leaf Blower has a crazy fast fire rate and very high damage. It does almost nothing against groups, however, but its a single target damage is among the best. I have to put the Leaf Blower into the A tier. The Rainbow Gun. Now while the Rainbow Gun has some pretty decent DPS, it's only against big groups and bosses like the Destroyer. It's really a weapon you use to just place and switch to a different weapon, but it's way too much of a hassle to try and get the perfect angle. I'm gonna put the Rainbow Gun into the F tier. The Heat Ray. The Heat Ray is very similar to the Leaf Blower. It's almost a direct upgrade to it in fact. Faster fire rate and much higher damage, a fantastic weapon against the in-game bosses, from Fishron to Empress to the Moonlord due to its hit scan beam. Very great weapon, just not as useful against those large groups of enemies. A tier for the Heat Ray. The Laser Machine Gun. Now I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but the Laser Machine Gun is one of the best magic weapons in the game. It fires so insanely fast and it only uses 4 mana, which means you can get just enough time to only get 1 stack of mana sickness, and it shreds every single late game boss. I'm gonna put the Laser Machine Gun in the A tier just because of the next weapon. The Charged Blaster Cannon. Now this thing is insane. I really don't have anything else to say except that it's absolutely busted crazy. It averages 4k damage a second on single target bosses, and when you get a group or a boss with multiple parts, it can hit up to 40,000 damage. S tier for the Blaster Cannon, busted ass weapon. The Bubble Gun. I used to love this weapon a lot before 1.3 came out, but now in the end game, I just don't see a lot of use for this thing. The worst range of all time, and its damage is not good enough to make up for it. I'm putting the Bubble Gun into the C tier just because you can still use it against some enemies and late game events. Let's move over to spellbooks. Starting off with the Water Bolt. The Water Bolt is an insanely good spellbook for where you can get it in the game. It used to be obtainable before defeating Skeletron, but now it's not possible outside of Hoik shenanigans and special seeds. However, I'm still going to put it into the A tier for just how useful it is for getting out of hard mode as well as still being usable in hard mode. The Book of Skulls. Dropped from Skeletron, the Book of Skulls is terrible. I really hate this thing. It's not good for any boss after Skeletron, and while having some minor use in dealing with enemies even in hard mode, the next spellbook does that way better. F tier for the Book of Skulls. The Demon Scythe. Now this weapon is obtainable as soon as you get into the game. It does so much damage, and with enough use, you can get used to the delay in how it fires and really keep some distance on enemies. If you get this drop early on, it can easily carry you into hard mode and beyond. S tier for the Demon Scythe. The Cursed Flames. The Cursed Flames is a very solid early hard mode spellbook, but it just doesn't do it like its Crimson counterpart does. It has a limited range, acting almost like one of the flower wands, and that alone really bumps it down all the way to the B tier. The Golden Shower. Now, dumb name aside, the Golden Shower is a glorious spellbook. It's easily obtainable right into hard mode, and you can just melt through the mech bosses, and more importantly, it can be used in a long and arduous fight against Duke Fishron to get the Razorblade Typhoon right out of the gate. S tier for the Golden Shower. The Crystal Storm, when compared to its two other early counterparts, is easily my least favorite of the three. It doesn't have piercing to deal with groups, its single target damage is great, but only against big enough enemies that its rapid firing slow projectiles can hit consistently. It's not terrible, so I'm gonna put it into the C tier, just not my favorite. The Magnet Sphere. I don't know if this is another dart weapon situation, and I'm just using this wrong, but it's so bad. It doesn't do nearly enough damage for how slow it moves and how slow it attacks from the ball. I don't know, I don't have much to say other than this thing is the definition of not good. F tier for the Magnet Sphere. The Razor Blade Typhoon. Easily one of the best magic weapons in the entire game, let alone one of the best spellbooks. Just take the Golden Shower and take out Fishron to grab this thing in a spellbooks only playthrough and beat the game in the next 2 hours. Great weapon, S tier, no doubt. The Lunar Flare. Unfortunately for the mages out there, the Lunar Flare is locked behind the final boss in the game, and its only real use would be taking out the Daytime Empress, and I don't even think it's the greatest for that. If it was one of the Nebula weapons instead, I'd put it in S for sure, but being locked behind postgame really bumps it down into the A tier. Finally, we have the other category. Starting off, we have the Crimson Rod, the one and only pre-Hardmode magic weapon in this category, and overall, it's okay. It is obviously a weapon to be used alongside other weapons, and with that, it cannot be F tier due to it being a free bit of extra damage. But in pre-hard mode, it's only really viable against the Brain of Cthulhu and Eater worlds, as well as groups of enemies, so I'm just going to put it into the C tier for its rather limited use case in pre-hard mode, and I hope the next update does add some more weapons into this category for pre-hard mode. The Ice Rod. Now the Ice Rod is definitely meant to be more of a tool than it is a weapon, but it's in the list, so we're gonna rank it. It has a surprisingly decent level of damage and a pretty high fire rate, but its uses are severely limited. That's because it creates a block if it doesn't connect with an enemy, and while it can fire through them, you cannot travel through them. So it does make some obstacles for you, but I think the weapon does actually have a decent enough use at the start of hard mode, just for being able to find the wizard and buy it. You can use it to take on some enemies for much better weapons later in the list. C tier for the Ice Rod as well. The Magic Dagger. Now, I debated on this thing's spot for a while. I tested it on a variety of hard mode bosses, and overall I have to ask, is this the best magic weapon in the game? Super fast fire rate, insanely high DPS, it pierces a couple of enemies at a time, and it has an incredibly low mana cost. I think the Magic Dagger has to go in S tier. It can carry you through the mechs, and it even seemed to do decent against Plantera. Insane weapon. Medusa's Head. Now Medusa's Head is an odd weapon. It only works if you're close to an enemy, making it a short range weapon. It can hit 3 enemies at a time and actually does decent damage without needing to aim or anything. Being able to right at the start of hard mode, you can use this to easily farm out tons of enemies, and that is its specialty. It can even do some decent enough work against the Destroyer. C tier for Medusa's Head just because of how little defense mages have and how close you have to be. The Clinger Staff. The Clinger Staff, dropped by Corrupt Mimics, is basically a corruption version of the Nimbus Rod in a way, except it's much shorter and it goes vertically. Overall, I think the weapon is actually pretty solid, but I feel like there are other weapons you can get that do the same thing, and especially one that's much better in the Nimbus Rod itself. I'm gonna put it into C tier, but I do recognize it's fantastic against groups of enemies due to its knockback. The Spirit Flame. I was genuinely surprised when I was testing out this weapon. It's available so early on and relatively easy at that. It just does so much damage and it can easily take care of the mechs all the way up to Gollum. I don't know if this weapon has any downsides outside of having the slow fire rate and projectile against those faster enemies. But even against like the twins, it didn't really matter. Not being able to target specific enemies is another downside, but not big enough to make this thing come out of the S tier. The Shadow Flame Hex Doll. I used to love this thing when it first got introduced in 1.3, but now I'm not too high on it. It's a really solid weapon, but it has one major downside, and that is, again, mages don't have high defense. And this thing's range is pretty short, meaning you have to get right in there on bosses and enemies. It's great against the Destroyer, but you're going to end up dead long before it takes out the boss fully. I'm going to put it into B tier, just because it is really solid against a couple of bosses and most groups of enemies, and it has a little bit more range than the Medusa's Head. The Bloodthorn. This is basically a slightly altered version of the Shadow Flame Hex Doll. It is actually very decent, but it has probably the biggest negative out of any of these weapons. Your enemy has to be on the ground or near a platform for them to get hit, and that makes it a lot worse. But hard mode does have a lot of events with ground enemies, and it can shred the Destroyer, no doubt. It also has some decent use against Gollum, but nothing crazy. I'm gonna put the Bloodthorn into the C tier. The Nimbus Rod. The Nimbus Rod is literally just the hard mode version of the Crimson Rod, and it's so much better. With bosses like the Destroyer in the way and all of the events that this thing can help in, as well as being completely usable all the way to the end of the game, even if it's just for a bit of chip damage. I'm gonna put it into the A tier just because in the end game, it's not gonna help with a lot of those bosses like it does early on. The Magical Harp. The Magical Harp is actually a sick weapon. Obtainable after defeating the twins, you could take them out and use this thing to just shred through the destroyer with its infinite piercing slow projectiles. The only bad thing this weapon has is against any other boss in the game, the slow projectiles are going to be hard to use, but I have to say its use in events and some of these bosses has to put it up in the A tier. The Toxic Flask. Now I really like the Toxic Flask, and it's not just because an NPC in my mod is modeled after Dr. Manfly. The Toxic Flask is a post-planetary weapon that just excels at the bosses and events like the Moons and Golem. Other than that, it's not the greatest, as fast bosses can move out of the cloud pretty quickly, and overall, it's just really made for crowd control. I'm gonna put it into the B tier. The Night Glow. The Night Glow is basically just an amped up version of the Spirit Flame, which means it's just as good at the bare minimum, but this thing goes far beyond. It still has a somewhat slow fire rate, but its projectiles are very, very fast, and its damage is just so insane. Decent against the Moonlord, but the other Empress drop is just far superior in my opinion, so I'm gonna put this one into the A tier. Here it is, the Stellar Tune. This might be tied for the best late game mage weapon in the game. It fires crazy fast, it has an odd pattern, but they seek enemies, so it makes up for it a little bit. It does little AoE explosions as well, and it's almost like the mage version of the Celebration Mark II. I love it, and it definitely deserves a spot in the S tier. The Nebula Arcanum. I really think this weapon is good, don't get me wrong. And it's definitely near the top of the list, but I just wish it was better against bosses. The only boss I really see this thing having use against is the Empress, and especially in daytime since you can just spam it and focus on dodging while it shreds her whenever she slows down. But I think the Nebula Blaze might actually just be better, so I'm putting the Arcanum into the B tier. The Nebula Blaze. Absolutely insane weapon. One of the best in the entire game. Its high damage and slight homing blast with a high fire rate make this thing an absolute monster. And I would say it's probably the best magic weapon in the game before Moonlord. I have to put this thing into the S tier just because it has so much insane use against any situation in the game. Finally, the Last Prism. Even with this thing's crazy mana consumption, it is completely worth it, especially if you're having trouble against the Daytime Empress. This thing can get you all the way through both phases in mere seconds, barely even letting the boss get its attacks off. So if you're having trouble with that, use the Last Prism and grab your Terra Prisma. The Last Prism has to go into the S tier. And that wraps up the Terraria Mage Weapon tier list. If you disagree with any of these picks, make sure to let me know in the comments, and if you didn't like something about this video, also let me know. I'm gonna wrap up here, but we're gonna quickly give some love to my members Cheesecake and Quackenstein. Thank you guys so much, and if you want to join them here at the end of these videos, you can go hit the join button. The first 10 members will get a founder's role in my Discord, which means you get to keep all those Discord exclusive member bonuses. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Love you guys, bye.